Reddit has been rumbling as of late, ever since Platinum Protoss figured out that the GSL win rates don't look so great for TOS. Thread after thread after thread has been started, just complaining about balance and flaming every Terran and Zerg that has ever existed. But yesterday there was a thread, which is this particular one, which is called "Would you change Protoss? What would you do? And why?" And I like that question. I like balance suggestions in general because I care about balance. You know, we have the Balance Council and all. And there were actually some interesting suggestions here. There were some less interesting suggestions, but the general format of this, I think, was quite good. So I figured we'll go over a couple of suggestions, complain, whine a little bit, and then we'll see what's good. We'll start here with Celesti, who says a late game upgrade that gives +1 range to Stalkers. Now, this has been suggested a lot, like a cybernetic score upgrade for the Stalker in the very late game that is fairly expensive to make the Stalkers more durable in these late game scenarios. Honestly, I'm not entirely opposed to it. There are certain things I do worry about, specifically in Protoss versus Terran. I think Stalkers might be too strong in that case against some of the air units. Good to deal with Vikings, with Liberators. Stalker Disruptor is already very powerful. Do we really want to buff that in a significant way? I'm not entirely sure if that's the case. You do run the risk when you give an upgrade to kind of an early/mid-game unit like that to make it an absolute, basically a never-ending mid-game from the Protoss side. And in combination with Disruptors, that might be kind of annoying, but honestly, against Zerg and in PvP, I think it would be a fairly positive change that I'm not necessarily against. For the Forge, Celesti says, shield upgrades that enable a small trickle of shield regeneration in combat. I also kind of like that, honestly, except I don't think there's going to be too much use for it, as most of the fights in StarCraft 2, except perhaps for mirrors, they don't take so long. So unless the shield regeneration is very quick, I don't think you're gonna see too much use. The problem here is that there's no real numbers being given. I mean, for the late game upgrade for Stalkers, yes, but for this one, no. Are we talking 5 shields per second or 1 shield every 3 seconds? I guess I'm not necessarily opposed to any of these things. But I think the main problem is that in StarCraft 2 fights don't tend to last very long. So I'm not sure how much of a buff this is. And I'm also not entirely sure what necessarily the goal is with a buff like that, which I wish that Celesti would have stated here. Also, Celesti wants something cooler with feedback. Conceptually, as a counterspell, it's fantastic, but there's very little play with it compared to Storm. Because Storm is good and this isn't asking to make Storm bad. Whether it's an upgrade on the Templar Archives that makes feedback restore energy of the caster proportional to energy it ate / damage it dealt to fuel an extra Storm. So basically like energy stealing. I think this is kind of stupid, honestly. This sounds super broken in Protoss versus Zerg, where you'd basically have infinite Storms if your opponent builds casters. It sounds pretty broken against Terran as well, in my opinion. Feedback would be freaking mental against Ghost. You could just feedback. I guess you needed like an added on, like a cooldown on feedback in that case, like maybe 5 seconds, which might actually make it worse. So I'm not entirely for that. I also think feedback is a spell that functions well. It does what it needs to do. I don't think we should mess too much with it. I'm also not entirely sure what goal you're trying to achieve here. I don't think Protoss necessarily really struggles with a lot of spellcasters in the late game that feedback can deal with. And here, Yappy Boy said, revert feedback to one-hit full energy medevacs and Ghost. The issue of High Templar countering battle cruisers and Tors is fixed already by removing their energy. Now, I think this is a bad suggestion. I think it's good that feedback doesn't one-shot. It feels a little bit ridiculous, especially for Ghost, but also for Investors and Vipers. I think it's kind of crazy that if a Viper tries to go in and it is slightly out of position, that the feedback would immediately kill it. That trait has never felt right to me, and that feels more fair at this point. I think that would be a bad change. I think there's different ways to nerf the medevac and Ghost if that's what you want. Once again, it's really kind of sad that no one really provides a why as to what they're doing. I don't understand what goal they're trying to achieve, which I think is one of the most important thing. A lot of the time, people actually kind of agree on what's wrong, but then they don't know what goals they want to achieve, and they also almost never specify any real changes. They'll say things like, Widow Mines are strong, and then nothing else. So I was really happy with the thread title, and some of the responses, as we'll see, are very good, but here, sadly, no why. All right. Amazing Superb. Mothership, if abducted, will only be dragged half the total distance to the Viper. See League of Legends Pike Hook for what this would look like. A great way to provide CC, but not be, I think that's crowd control, but not be 100-0 death sentence. That honestly does kind of sound interesting if you could make that just for the Mothership. It often feels like the Mothership is such a stupid unit to control. I think at lower level, like lower level Protoss players absolutely can't control it. The way it moves around like a complete moron, an absolute idiot. I think that is... I'm not entirely opposed to this. I think it sounds cool. I'm not sure how possible this is, but this is an okay suggestion, honestly, in my book. It would make the Mothership maybe a little bit too strong on the higher level, where you'd need multiple abducts to actually kill it. I'm not sure how great that is. I think the Mothership in late game PvZ already has such a massive role at very high level Protoss versus Zerg. Difficult one. I think for lower level, good. For higher level, I think not so great. How about just massive units in general? I think that's a terrible change. That would make massive units just a little bit too strong. Things like Colossi and such. Would not be a fan of that. All right. Colossus cannot be disabled by Raven if protected by Guardian Shield. That would make the Raven practically useless against Colossus openers. I'm not a fan of that. I do, however, feel that the interaction between Raven and Colossus, as it currently is, feels very dumb in a way. There are certain situations in which the Protoss just gets 2 interference matrix thrown on its Colossus face and then instantly loses the game. It feels like it has very little to do with a strategy game and more whether the opponent can click interference matrix twice or maybe you manage to hit your 4 force fields in time. So yes, the interference matrix are there, but he can't move in. That entire interaction, it just doesn't sit well with me. Just not a fan of how the interference matrix works in the Protoss versus Terran matchup. I'm not saying it's necessarily imbalanced. I think it just feels stupid a lot of the time. I really do feel like that. Caillou 1412. I like that we can see what race they are as well. Give Stalkers. Like this guy is a Terran, and he's giving Protoss a buff in Protoss versus Zerg. This is the Terran PSYOP operation. Give Stalkers an upgrade that deals bonus damage to burrowed units. I guess technically that work versus Mines, but I have a feeling my man Caillou 1412 was not thinking about Widow Mines as the main priority for this. I think the moment he realized that Widow Mines are also burrowed, he's like, nah, never mind. And what about depots then? Depots also burrow. Do we also give Stalkers more damage to them? I don't think this is a correct approach. I think a lot of these buffs are kind of centered around making Stalker more of a super core unit, but I already think the Stalker is a pretty core unit for Protoss that has a good role. I don't think we want Mass Stalker to be capable to be played in every matchup the entire game long. I think it's nice that the Lurker requires different counters. I also personally do not believe that the Lurker is an issue in Protoss versus Zerg at the highest level. Now, I know whenever I say this, people will flame the ever-living crap out of me because at their level, it is a massive issue. I do not think that giving Stalkers extra damage to burrowed units will solve that issue. I'm always open to suggestions to fix lower-level things, but it is very difficult to fix a problem like Lurker on the lower level without completely making the Lurker useless at a higher level. Just the splash units in general are freaking good at lower level because people's micro tends to be a little bit worse. So I'm not a huge fan of this particular suggestion. Now here we have FP Linek, who also gives us his credentials. I've been playing this game since 1998 and have played over 30k games at master level. I was actually number 1 on Brood War US West ladder for a week too. I was thinking about this last night, and here are the subtle changes I think would help Protoss. If Zerg gets creep and Terran gets sensor towers, Protoss deserves something too. I suggest +3 vision range for pylons. We will see players use spotter pylons more often around the map, and will help a lot versus early game mine drops. I actually really like this suggestion. but I am kind of afraid that it doesn't necessarily target the people that need help against Widow Mines. So I'm not saying that professional players don't lose games against Widow Mines. Okay, I've seen Hero lose 12 probes to a Widow Mine drop just as well. But I think most of the time it's lower level Protoss that really struggle with the Widow Mine drops, and lower level players tend to not spread pylons anyway in the first place. So this is a buff for... This will help at, I guess, like the Masters level and above, like high Masters to high Grand Masters. I think it will be a great tool, but I don't think this actually targets the population that needs the help the most against Widow Mine drops. I also think +3 is a lot, but I do like this. The thinking here, I think, is very good. I think like a +1 vision range or a +2 vision range, definitely actually, it does kind of go a long way at the high level to deal with air threats coming out of the Terran. Especially with Blink builds, it can be pretty tricky to figure out where medevacs come from. So this is something that I actually don't mind considering. I think this is an interesting... For me, this has been the most interesting suggestion in this thread that I think would have some real application. For 2, a late game Zealot upgrade similar to Metabolic Boost. I would like that. But not as crazy as 40%, of course. Dual Templar training, requires both Dark Shrine and Templar archives, increase Zealot attack speed by 25%. If all units are 3-3, Cracklings would still destroy them, but the fight wouldn't be so Zerg-sided. Another Zealot upgrade, but available by default. Okay, wait. Let's first deal with this one. I think technically this sounds fun and cool, but the problem with Zealots is that they're so easily warp-inable in your opponent's main base due to the Prism. So if you have this in late game and you can warp in Zealots in the main base, it will be really difficult for a Zerg to deal with this, and also for Terran to deal with this effectively or efficiently. Zealots are really good on micro. Links are also really good on micro, but it's difficult to get them into good positions. Like if you have 30 links, they're really good when they're out in the open, but when they're choked up in a base, that actually tends to be an advantage for the defender. But with Zealots, because you don't need as many Zealots for it to be dangerous, I don't think we'd want to individually boost them as well in those very late game scenarios. I also think that the Zealot is actually good in the late game already. Like I don't think the weakness of the Zealot in my mind is not the late game. And if it is, maybe in Protoss versus Terran, it is a little bit weak in the late game, but that's due to the EMP. And this upgrade will not fix that. It will have to do with something with the HP, or it needs to be, invincible versus EMP. EMP can't hit it. That would be a massive buff, not a good one, but that could fix that problem. So I think this fixes a problem that doesn't exist. Like it's already strong in harassment situations in the late game with 3/3 upgrades, and it's going to remain weak against big Terran armies that have EMP. So I think this is completely pointless in my mind. As like it doesn't achieve any goal that once again, no goal is stated, but I don't think it achieves any goal either that we would want to achieve. Another Zealot upgrade, but available by default. Hardened Shield, basically a door unit that holds it in position, like Observer mode. If you want to get really spicy, you could have it add 1 armor while in this mode, but you could also skip this. Not a huge fan of that. The door unit upgrade. I feel like things that allow for turtling more, that make it harder to bust the Protoss wall, are generally not good. I think the problem with having the unit in hold position is that once again at lower levels it can be quite difficult to not use the all army hotkey, or just to remember that you need to have a unit in your wall at all times. But I'm not sure if I'd want that to be stronger. Like people will not remember, or they will remember. But if they do remember, I don't think it needs to be stronger. I think if you want to fix the walling of Protoss against Zerg, you'd need something that makes it easier for people to remember to wall. Like how with Terran you can up and lower the depot. So you just full wall and then you can do it like that. 3 small changes that would help a lot, and the other races can't really complain about. I think I complain about number 2 for sure, and number 3 I also don't like. Protoss usually needs a robotics facility early game and will usually go into Robobay afterwards. It will only be in late game that we see them able to afford to go into Zealot attack speed upgrade. And by that time, Terran usually has a death ball of MMM which shreds Zealots. This will give Zealot advantage in small numbers, but MMM will still have a massive advantage in large numbers. Should introduce some good counterplay and make games fun to watch and play. Yeah, so he's mainly focused around his number 2 upgrade, I feel like, and I think that is by far his worst suggestion. So, what was your name again? FP Linek. I do like the suggestions, but I think number 2 is your worst. Number 1 actually has some potential, and we'll see what happens with that. All right, Timur Hu. Introduce a wall or door building or repurpose an existing building that you can use the wall of your base instead of relying on having a unit there on hold position. Yes, this is basically Protoss players wanting the depot raise lower function. I do like that in general the races aren't the same and you have different ways of walling, and some races don't need a wall at all because they always have map control. Zerk. I think this is really useful for lower level play, and I'm just not sure about it if that's the way you want to fix this issue. But I mean, people have been asking for a wall or door for absolute years now. I personally feel like it's wrong, but balance-wise, I have nothing really against it. I think at the highest level, it doesn't really matter that much. But at the level slightly below the highest level, I think at like the Grandmaster level, people full walling in PvZ going straight into Skytos is going to be even more frustrating if they can just lower their depot or lower their pylon or whatever it's going to be. So I can imagine specifically Zergs not being too fond of this. And it could introduce some annoying things for Terran as well, which isn't mentioned here, but there's often a scenario in which you put down a Reaper wall, but the Adept can't stand on the cliff anymore of where the Reaper would jump off. Now that would be possible again. So you could just put the Adept on the cliff, which makes it even harder to scout for Terran, which is, I think, an unintended consequence of the wall or the door building that I don't think you quite want to have. But once again, yeah, very difficult. I've been thinking about the wall or the door for years as well, and I like it for the very lower level players. I don't like it so much for the mid Grandmasters, and I think at the highest level it doesn't really matter too much. Give back the hardened shields to Immortals. You could not. I don't really care about that very much. The hardened shield is that every attack while there's still shields active means that the Immortal only takes 10 damage max, I believe. Meaning that the hard-hitting units deal less damage, and the Lynx and the Marines, they just deal normal damage to them. So yeah, I don't think that really changes very much. I'm not a huge fan of that. EMP would still be really good against Immortals, which I think most suggestions here are targeting TVP. Give back starting energy upgrade of each caster unit. So this is specifically talking about Caldarian Amulet, which is an upgrade that Templar had that gave them 25 extra energy when warping in and basically instantly having a storm. I think this would be a terrible change and would make Protoss extremely overpowered. I think this is a really, really bad change. I absolutely love that that's gone. That was bad for the game. It makes turtling so much easier, means that having to anticipate for things isn't necessary anymore. Like just having cannons and a battery would not be enough. Like you need to have the Templar there ahead of time, which means that you need to pre-split things. I think, yeah, starting energy upgrades I'm absolutely not a fan of. I had a second upgrade for Zealots. I've seen this before, and then people have also said to bring back like the charge damage that the Zealot have. Once again, I don't think the Zealot is too weak at any point in the game. I think it has its use in the early game versus Terran, in the early game versus Zerg, in the mid game versus Protoss, in the mid game versus Zerg, mid game versus Terran, and in the late game versus Zerg, Terran, and Protoss. It literally has a purpose everywhere, and I think it's one of the best units that Protoss has. It's a beautiful mineral sink, and it does the job of harassing very well in the late game. I don't actually think the Zealot is the issue at all. The only issue I have with the Zealot is that if you have a very Zealot-heavy army in the mid game against Terran, is that you feel very powerful until Ghosts come out. And there's a bit of a power imbalance at that point, which I'm not quite sure how you would bridge that by making the Zealot stronger. I feel like you'd have to make the Protoss transitions maybe a little bit smoother. I don't think tweaking the Zealot in general is going to do anything good for the game. It might do something good for Protoss, though. If we get +8 charge damage, I'm never losing to Terran again, that's for sure. Improve Colossus so it's worth its price, or reduce the price. Now, this kind of hooks into what I said last, is to make the transitions easier. You could consider making the Colossus cheaper, or maybe even build a little bit faster. That would, if you make it build a little bit faster, that would be a massive nerf to the Raven, because it would mean that you could have more Colossus out by the time the first Raven push hits. The problem with the Colossus is that the Colossus pretty much stops mid-game Terran timings, early mid-game Terran timings. So the initial 3 Rex push that Terran has will always consist of a lot of Marines. Naturally, that's how Terran build orders work. They lack in gas until they have all their infrastructure set up. And at that point, they can start adding a lot of Marauders. And at that very first point, when there's loads of Marines and there is a Colossus out, the Colossus is super good. While after that, it loses in strength. So making it cheaper or quicker to get would make the mid-game in PvT, I think, a lot more boring and a lot more one-sided and favorable for Protoss, and make Colossus all-ins as well a lot more powerful, which once again is something that I don't think we necessarily want. I think Colossus all-ins are okay already in the matchup, so I don't think that is really necessary to do. If I were to change the Colossus, it would be later on in the game to give it extra damage somehow, because the Colossus tends to be really strong as it comes out, but it really falls off hard once Ghost numbers go up, Marauder numbers go up. I think in this case, like a late game upgrade somehow might be worthwhile to, like, I don't want to say increase the range, I think that is bad, but maybe just have another, like a separate damage upgrade for the Colossus that really adds some oomph to it. You know, when the Marine numbers are already lower, and you're working with loads of Marauders and Ghost against Terran and or with Terran, and as Zerg it's mainly Banelings. Colossus are not so great versus that. I think that is the only thing that I can really see, but I would have to think about the numbers. I just came up with that on the spot, but I think a late game Colossus buff, or like a mid to late game kind of transitionary timing, is a fair thing to ask for, I think, because the Colossus falls off pretty darn hard, specifically versus Terran. I think there's like a massive drop-off with that unit where it just doesn't feel like it deals any damage anymore once your opponent has more than 3 medevacs and pure Marauder Ghost. Make the Disruptor a bit easier to use and less reliant on luck. I think, no, I don't think so. I think the Disruptor is plenty easy to use, and it is not very reliant on luck. You can right-click so that it follows a unit, the Purification Nova. It's difficult to use, but most casters are difficult to use. If you don't control most casters well, they'll die. And the Disruptor really is just a caster, so just doesn't use energy. I don't know. Create a proper counter to EMP. I don't really know what that would look like, though. Yeah. There's an interesting suggestion we'll get to in a little bit. That actually does do something to EMP, but we'll get there in a bit. I'm not a huge fan of it, but next one, I'd also like something that improves late game PvZ, but I have no idea what that would be like either, so that's not a suggestion. I can't really comment on that. Make sentries useful for something. Now, this is a statement that is pretty much like saying make Widowmine drops weaker without a real suggestion. Like, I appreciate always when people, you know, have some type of input, but this is almost completely useless. I'm not trying to pick on this guy, and he's a lovely guy, and, you know, and 22 people did agree with him. I agree with him as well. I'm a Protoss player. But whenever, I notice this, whenever people engage in balance discussions, very often, rather than having like a specific policy or a specific thing, they'll throw out like a very general statement that is hard to disagree with. But you don't really improve the situation. Or what's even worse, other people will disagree with your statement. And then rather than talking about the change, they'll just start talking about your statements. Like, oh, Widowmine drops if you just micro. Well, they're not that strong. You know, it's like, well, give us something specific to work with. Then you can criticize that, tell us what your objective is, and then we can work around it. And we can see if we can maybe improve your idea. If you just say, make sentries useful for something, then like this is the very starting point. But this is not a balanced suggestion, which is why I actually like the threat name. Would you change Protoss? What would you do? And why? And this does not meet the requirements of the threat. It should be the minimum. Reddit moderator should have stepped in. Wilkie, 1 day ago, said, I think the big issue is that while the War Prism is cool as a backstab tool, the fact that it can be used as a mobile reinforcement point for pushes means that it negates a fundamental RTS rule, Defender's Advantage, and therefore every unit that can be warped in needs to be balanced with this in mind. I don't know what the solution to this issue is, but it feels like over the last several years, Protoss have been nerfed to compensate for having a very easy and reliable way to negate Defender's Advantage, whereas an alternative approach could have been to limit or take away this ability and increase the general power level of gateway units from what they are now. This is a take that I think a lot of people have, and I don't think it is incorrect. It is really difficult to touch Protoss because of the Prism, but it's really difficult to mess with the Prism without completely ruining Protoss, because Protoss relies on the Prism in almost every single matchup, in almost every single situation. So you make the warp-in field smaller. That means early game pushes will not be as impacted as much. But in the late game, it will be pretty bad. There's so many things you can do and that you can kind of shift around. I feel like there is something here. Once again, we don't have a real suggestion out of him. I've been thinking of just having a slower warp-in, but then you really need to buff the early game units of Protoss in order to kind of make up for that. Otherwise, there's not going to be any aggressive play possible from Protoss. But if you buff the early game units for Protoss, Terran is going to be having an incredibly difficult time doing anything with 3-Rex attacks. So I think you end up creating a very turtly type of matchup, especially in Terran versus Protoss, which is why it's so difficult to touch. Once again, if there's any suggestions that are specific, please do leave them in the comments, as always. I do read those. I'm interested in it, as I always am. Negating the fundamental RTS rule of Defender's Advantage, I say, so does the Nidus Canal. And B, yeah, but only to a degree, because it doesn't work for the Robo or Stargate units. I think this doesn't really matter so much, that it doesn't work for Robo or Stargate units. Usually having 12 Zealots in your main base is good enough, or having reinforcements with pure gate units. That really does the trick, because you hardly ever really lose your Colossi or Disruptor before you lose your gateway unit. So I think it doesn't matter that much. And Nidus Canal is very different. It's every time you need to use it, there's a warning. It takes way more time to set it up, and you can't just put it in the main base as easily without being scouted and being prepared for. Like, you have so much time. I think this is an unfair comparison, the Nidus Canal and the War Prism. Okay, Nathanius says Protoss needs a buff to scaling and a nerf to proxy/cheese. These two things would help tremendously with their brand issue and the disconnect between ladder and competitive Protoss builds. I mean, once again, no real specific buffs in this case, just a buff to scaling. So I guess like something along the lines of a 4th upgrade maybe, or it's very difficult to say anything about it if there's no real suggestion made. But I guess maybe like a late game upgrade for the Colossus would be something that would be included here. I'm not quite sure what is, falls under that umbrella. And a nerf to proxy/cheese. Now, the second part of this statement to me sounds foreign in my ear, because I have absolutely no experience with these things, or hardly any. I'm not a massive proxy player myself, and cheese from Protoss doesn't really seem to work at the very highest level. Hero does play some cheesy build orders every now and again, but even he has largely stepped away from doing extremely wild things in PvT and PvP and PvZ, because it just doesn't tend to work so well at the highest level. So here I need like specific examples, what could be nerfed for the lower level while not touching the higher level, because there, if anything, Protoss is kind of weak aggressively, majority of the time in my opinion, except for 4-gate Blink. I don't think there's that many great aggressive builds for Protoss. You have Glaive Adepts in PvZ, but that hardly does any damage these days, most of the time. Rufio6 says, Colossi keep getting wrecked by Ravens. Stronger gateway units or bring back the aggressive shield battery. Okay. Stronger gateway units or bring back the aggressive shield battery. So Colossi keep getting wrecked by Ravens. And the solution is to bring back the aggressive shield battery, which means the shield battery right now starts with half energy when you build it too far away from a nexus, and then would start with more energy. I'm not entirely sure what this would fix with the Colossi getting wrecked by Ravens. I guess often you're defending positions that aren't close enough to a nexus. and then this would help them stay alive a bit longer. But I think the real solution to this problem is having more sentries. So if you get 4 sentries and then you get interference matrix, you can force field and keep your opponent out. And that is the actual counter that we already used. So I don't think bringing back the aggressive shield battery really fixes this issue. And even if it does, or even if it did, I don't think that's something we would want to do. Stronger gateway units, I think, would have a lot of problems if you just straight up make them stronger. I don't think the problem for Protoss is in the very early game in PvZ or in PvT necessarily. I do find it annoying, though, that I've mentioned before. The Raven-Colossus interaction annoys me. I don't think it's imbalanced necessarily. I think it's a little bit strong at times, and it feels broken when you're not ready for it. But I think it's just a stupid mechanic. It works really dumb. I don't like it. Buff the sentry. There's nothing here, so I can't comment on it. It seems like Zealots need a little extra also. I don't agree with that. In most of the ESL games, it just seems like Stalkers are the units that stick around versus any matchup. Yes, Rufio identifies this correctly. Stalker is the unit, indeed. That's really the pure core unit of Protoss. But there's no suggestion here, so I'm not sure what the statement was. I forgot Void Rays are even a thing since I haven't seen one in pro matches in a while. Also true. I don't think this is a bad thing. I freaking hate Void Rays and how they function. They almost never have fun interactions. The Void Ray over the past 13 years in StarCraft 2 has provided some of the worst games in the history of StarCraft. Periods in which the Void Ray was prevalent in any matchup were always the worst periods in that matchup. I think it's okay to say, okay, we don't know how to incorporate the Void Ray in competitive play without making the game freaking suck. And in that case, I think it's fine to say Void Rays, not great. You know, they have some niche uses maybe in very late game PvZ and defensively in PvP in the 1-gate expand versus 2-gate scenarios. But anywhere else, the Void Ray can suck it. And I think this is just something we're going to have to live with because the Void Ray is garbage unit. Set IT Reddit. I agree. I don't think Disable should be able to target Colossus. That would be a great change. No, this would be a terrible change. It would make Protoss mid-game way too strong. Things like robo-openers would be extremely powerful in the PvT matchup, I think. Or a lot more powerful. And also things like Blink into Colossus, Phoenix Colossus would be a lot better. I think we don't... So it's really stupid because I don't want to buff Protoss against the initial 3-rex pressure of the Terran. But it also feels like Protoss dies a lot against the initial 3-rex pressure of the Terran. I think the problem for me there is that it feels super hit or miss. Either the Protoss has no trouble staying alive, or the Terran just walks over the Protoss and it completely owns it. And it feels like the difference can be so tiny. It's like often depending on like a single matrix hitting or not, a force field, you know, connecting on the right dot, a mine connection. It just feels like Protoss is so inconsistent in the defense. That's why a lot of Protoss players have switched to Phoenix Colossus as of late, as that does give some more consistency. But even there, we see people die all the time. Personally, I don't actually quite know what the ideal solution is. I feel like Protoss ground units are the least microable and the slowest. I really feel like they should increase the rate of fire for Stalkers, but keep the damage per second the same. I think this is usually a nerf into the late game as well, right? If you have the damage per second the same, then once more armor upgrades get in. Or is that not how it works? I guess if you keep up with the attack upgrades, it might be fine. I'm not a huge fan of it. I think a nice thing about having the current rate of fire as well is that you can one-shot things easily. So this would probably make it worse against things like drops, and 4-gate blink would be weaker as well, which are actually some of the very important builds that we have right now. Le Chateau said, Stalkers used to be that way before Legacy of the Void. They were worse. The lower rate of fire means they can burst things down. Yeah, okay, so basically the same thing. Yeah, I already read this earlier, of course. Went through the comments to click away some of the really bad ones so we don't have to see them, or the ones that weren't relevant at all. All right, Familiar Tart 7390. I think the general issue I see with Protoss isn't their big hitters and classics, Colossus, Stalkers, Carriers, Disruptors, etc., underperforming, but the rest of the army struggling to actually do meaningful damage in the big blowout fights that are kind of the bread and butter of Protoss play. Some ways to buff them or at least help them. Let Zealots mineral walk when they charge. They'll slip through other friendly units to crash into their targets if Blizzard really wanted to go all out, adding in another upgrade for Zealot to help boost their performance. Attack speed is an easy one, or if they wanted to get weird, an upgrade that minorly restores shields to friendly units around the Zealot that dies, really making Zealots that premier frontline shield unit. They were built to be, call it my life for ire, call it a day, numbers-wise. This is actually kind of interesting, the shield regeneration explosion. If this is a very late game upgrade, it really would only be useful when Zealot numbers are relatively high. And it wouldn't benefit Zealots as much in drops, I guess, which is also interesting in my mind. Maybe run-bys, like having 10 Zealots as a run-by and then just splashing heal over each other is a little bit broken. This is a really cool suggestion that I'd honestly never thought about. As a creative thinking, you could kind of mess with the numbers, and it could undo EMP as well, which is super cool, right? If you could splash shields, and you could maybe micro Zealots back, or like self-kill some Zealot to save an Immortal or something. Like there's some real micro potential with it as well, where you want the Zealots to die. Like a mine shot on top of a Zealot, and you could make it, make the Zealot splash around. And I don't know. I kind of like this. I'm not sure how easy this is to implement, but I think this is a really cool suggestion that I have never heard of before either. This is kind of brilliant. Familiar Tart. Future balance designer, guys. Who knows? All right. Probably wouldn't say a huge amount, 5 or 10 shield, blah, blah, blah. Okay, yeah, nice. If I had to say how to buff, say, Adepts, another Protoss unit that gets built in niche situations and never again once past the 5 or 6 minute mark, if at all, give it a short-range anti-air, as in basically under the flying unit. Allows them to help against Corruptors and Vikings, against Colossus, by threatening with balls of shades under the fighter count. In the early game, lets them annoy Overlords and plink medevacs. They even had an anti-air attacking campaign, and it felt decently balanced. Would shake up the Stalker's hegemony on being the mainline viable Protoss unit. I think this does nothing for the Adept. The Adept has different issues. The Adept is terrible against Splash. The Widow Mines and Ghost completely destroy Adepts, and Banelings completely destroy Adepts in the PvZ matchup. And Disruptors, as well as just the Stalkers with their range, destroy Adepts. So I don't think it would be a very minor buff, but it would not make them more viable after the first 5-6 minutes. It would make them stronger in the first 6 minutes, which is where they're already strong. So you're missing your objective. This is, by the way, this comment, Familiar Tart, this is why I want people to write why they want it to be done. They want their objective with the change, because he misses his objective. This particular change by itself is maybe not even bad, but if his objective is to make the Adepts last longer, this completely misses the goal, which is why I freaking love that this is the best comment in the thread so far. Not necessarily because of the suggestions, although I really like the first suggestion about the restoring shields, but just the way he wrote this comment is freaking brilliant. Makes it easy to criticize and easy to work on this guy's ideas. Very nice. Good job, Familiar Tart. You're the MVP. Last unit that sort of struggles to keep up is the High Templar. They get warped in for Archons and rarely again. Amulet and instant warp in Storms was too strong, but I think an upgrade that lets Templars regenerate their energy back faster while in the energy field of a pylon would allow them to see a lot more play. This honestly is not a terrible plan either. Understanding that Amulet and instant warp in Storms were broken, but it does suck if you have completely empty Templar, and it's often better to warp in new ones and more of the old ones into Archons. I don't completely mind this, honestly. This also might make them more useful against Terran, where now if they get EMP'd, they're completely useless for the next 17 minutes. But if you could send them back home, it would encourage micro. I think this is cool. I actually think this is a good upgrade idea, or just to have it as a general ability. There's nothing wrong with that. Like the ideas, feel free to say them so Blizzard can use them. Hate the ideas, feel free to tell me why. Think cardboard circlings are adorable? Let me know. Have a good day, folks. This is the most wholesome person in the entire thread, with a freaking perfect post. Some decent suggestions, or at least suggestions that we can work with. We're gonna end with this. I had more downstairs, but I didn't know this guy was here. Familiar Tart, 7390. Congratulations. You are the balance complainer of the week. If you have any balance suggestions, be sure to leave them in the comments, and please write them in the correct format. What from now on will be known as the Tart 7390. It's a certain form, you know, the TAR 7390. Like how you have the WBEN 8, you know, you need to file for your taxes or something. This is the same. File in that form downstairs in the comments and we'll have a look. Maybe I'll go over the comments in like a stream or a future video. This went way longer than I thought it would. I didn't want to record for 40 minutes, but I hope this was fun. If this was fun, if you'd like to hear me ramble, be sure to leave that in the comments as well. I'm not sure if this is something you are interested in at all. I enjoy talking about StarCraft. I could talk about StarCraft for 5 hours straight if I wanted to. But I do understand that it is a little bit technical and I can't be bothered to properly edit things on top either. So it might be a little bit dry. But if you do enjoy it, please let me know. This type of feedback is nice to have as well. So yeah, once again, thanks for watching as well, if you said it all the way out. And I'll see all of you probably tomorrow again. So this video is every day this week, just like every week, except for one day of the week when Kevin rests. All right, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.